Kalisparasas, good evening, everyone. Apologies for that delay. We're having a few technical issues, but fortunately we have our good friend Kostas Valentis with us, and if he can't fix it, it isn't fixable. So again, apologies for the delay. Welcome to another evening seminar brought to you by the Greek community of Melbourne. Tonight we continue with our 1821 bicentenary theme, which is a seminar in memory of Theodoros Kolokotronis, one of the preeminent figures and protagonists of the Greek War of Independence, or Hieros tis Morias, as it's affectionately called. And in this respect, allow me to thank tonight's sponsors, Jenny Proimos and the law firm Mitraka Savas & Co., and you're all encouraged to become future sponsors of a seminar of your choice. Before I continue, allow me to say a few words about next week's seminar by Dr. Adi Gunari. It's on Konstantinos Doxiadis, a visionary urban planner and architect who rose to fame in the 1960s. He was quite an influential figure during his time and was also the leading architect for the city of Islamabad, the new capital of Pakistan that was being built. It's a fascinating story. But now let's turn to the old man of Moria. The Greek Revolution was a messy affair. There were political intrigues, setbacks, internal rivalries and infighting, but also acts of bravery, valor and sacrifice. It was a complex affair, despite most of us being reared up on a glossed-up narrative through history textbooks. This is not surprising. When the independence movement finally became a reality, the various wants and goals of the different Greek social groups were quite divergent to create strong cohesion amongst them. After the war against the Ottoman Empire began, the dissimilarities and aims of the different groups came to the forefront. The Greek elites wanted to maintain political power bereft of the Ottomans. The military leaders wanted to create their own centers of power, and the peasants, who by the way were oppressed both by Greek and Ottoman overlords, wanted a chance at owning land and improving their living conditions. Nowhere were these differences echoed more loudly than the Peloponnese, due to the fact that it was a semi-autonomous state under Ottoman rule. This lack of an Ottoman presence allowed for the creation of regional identities and power vacuums under wealthy landowners that not only turned into pronounced factionalism once the revolution began. In this context, diaspora Greeks, former klephts in Armatoli, and Greek regional strongmen all tried to carve out a role for themselves in the struggle. Kolokotronis came out of this background as well, which our speaker will elaborate upon tonight. Nonetheless, the Greek Revolution was an event of monumental significance for its time, and not only because it occurred in an age of revolutions. In a global context, it became an inspiration for other subjugated peoples. Its initial proclaimed constitutions aspired to radical democratic ideals, quite contrary to the authoritarian nature of many of the empire states of the time. But every liberation struggle requires its heroes. In this respect, Theodoros Kolokotronis is the archetypal Greek hero. Mentioned 1821, and to the average Greek, Kolokotronis would be the first figure to come to mind. These brigand-like figures, and there are quite a few, Karaskakis, Sandroutos, Iakos, and others, strike an emotional chord with your average Hellene. We're also fortunate that Kolokotronis left behind his memoirs, a narrative biography compiled by Yorgos Tertsetis, a former magistrate and independence fighter. And to present this seminar tonight is someone who needs no introduction to the Greek community, Dr. Stavroula, or Nikoloudis, head of the Modern Greek program at La Trobe University. And in this respect, I'd like to publicly thank Steffi for her tireless work in turning the program around, and it's great to see the enrollment numbers showing an upward trajectory. Steffi grew up and still lives in Richmond, which was a Greek ghetto in the 70s. Her undergraduate studies were at the University of Melbourne, where she did a BA and MA in archaeology. This was followed by a PhD at the University of Texas in Austin. Her current research deals with questions relating to ethnic identity and cultural diversity, migration, diaspora communities, diachronic language development, and language education. Nor has she relinquished her interest and passion for the Bronze Age and Mycenaean studies. Steffi, the floor is yours. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Nick, and Costa and everyone else behind the scenes. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands from which I'm joining you, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present. On behalf of the Greek Studies program at La Trobe, I'd also like to acknowledge our generous benefactor, the late Mr. Anastasios Vassilogiannis, the steering committee that's been established to support Greek studies at La Trobe, and all the groups and individuals who campaigned last year to ensure the continuity of the program. And thank you everyone for tuning in today. Anniversaries like the bicentenary of the Revolution of 1821 offer us the opportunity to retell and reflect upon our stories and to learn from them. And that's how I'm approaching tonight's presentation. While the revolution is not my area of expertise, I'm certainly very much interested in it as a pivotal moment in the long history of Greece. Theodoros Kolokotronis was one of the revolution's heroes. Some would say the face of the revolution. He was a man of the people, and much has been written about him and his exploits. What I'd like to do tonight is focus on his words, his own words, his memoirs, as dictated to George Tertsetis in the summer of 1836, and to try to consider how his recollection helps us to understand the revolution better, what was Kolokotronis's contribution to it, and to think about the lessons that his story provides to us. At the outset, I'd like to say that I think we should expect that such a prominent leader would have both friends and foes. It goes with the territory. A leader can't please everyone all the time. And Kolokotronis's character was such that while he could make friends very easily, he could also cause friction that could generate rivalries just as easily. Those who knew him say that he was a strong, ruthless man with quite a temper. On the other hand, the emotion that he showed at the funerals of a number of his adversaries reflects a more tender side. He was quite emotional at the funeral of Zaimis, for instance, and somebody noticed this and found it quite odd and asked him, "Don't you remember all the problems that you had with him?" And Kolokotronis replied, "We were often on opposite sides, but I never hated him. Δεν τον εμίσησα ποτέ." Kolokotronis does not go into detail about his own character. He shows great restraint in his memoirs. He tends to speak about his actions rather than his himself or his personal life. He mentions that he marries Ekaterini, whom he loved very much, but nothing else about his wife or about his children, except in relation to the fighting that they were present at. He doesn't give us much at all about his feelings, except when he speaks about his love and concern for his lands, ta μέρη του και τον τόπο του, his part of the world, his patridha, his homeland, and his ethnos, his nation. At one point in his memoirs, he does say that at a particular meeting of leaders, the Bishop of Arta raised his voice at him and stamped his foot at him. He was angry at Kolokotronis's accusation that the other leaders hadn't consulted him about a particular matter. And Kolokotronis responded in what was quite a heated exchange, "Don't you stamp your foot at me. I can stamp down my sword and cut off your head. Μη μου βροντάς το πόδι, γιατί βροντώ το σπαθί και σου κόβω το κεφάλι." And he says to Tertsetis, "Εις τον θυμόν μου λέγω τέτοια." When I'm angry, I say those kinds of things. Kolokotronis's memoirs are, of course, biased to some extent. He's giving us his story after all. And yet, Ioannis Genavios makes the important point that no contradictory material was presented to dispute his version of events, his individual actions in the war. On the whole, Genavios believes that his account of these events is dispassionate, fairly impartial, very sober, and unpretentious. Just a map to remind us of the extent of the Ottoman Empire at the height of its power. And this map here shows you the gradual formation of the modern nation state of Greece. At the end of the revolution, it was concentrated in the dark blue parts here. So most of Kolokotronis' activities take part in the Peloponnese, right here, under Ottoman control, and the Ionian Islands under British oversight. Just note the different zones then of the Peloponnese or Moria, Rumeli, north central Greece, and the islands Spetses, Psara, Ivra. Most of the action in the memoirs, as I said, takes place in the Peloponnese. And if we zoom in on that area, this is a modern map, but it gives you a clear idea of where Tripolitsa, Tripoli, historically known as Tripolitsa, is right in the center of the Peloponnese. And this will be a very important location for Kolokotronis' activities. Also, note Corinth, the gateway to the north, Argos over here, Nafplion, Patra in the northwest, Kalamata in the southwest, and Mani, of course, as well. Now, the Ottoman Empire was a vast empire with regional variations in the way that it was ruled. Generally, well, the Sultan was the absolute ruler, but the governance of the empire was decentralized. So each province was overseen by a centrally appointed Muslim governor or pasha. So there's a pasha of the Peloponnese with his base at Tripolitsa in the center. And then at the local level, there would be Muslim officials and or Orthodox Christian priests and notables who settled disputes, collected taxes from the people living in that area for the Ottomans. There were variations from region to region, but more specifically and in a general sense, at the top of the hierarchy was the Pasha, and then on his council sat 2 Muslim and 2 Christian notables. At the district level, these notables looked after taxation and judicial matters. And then you have the village notables, 1 or 2 vimoyerodes, or there are various terms used to describe them, but they would be looking after local affairs, the budget in a general sense, and making sure that peace, public order was maintained. There was resistance to the Ottomans by the klephts up until this point. So these were the bandits, the thieves who lived in bands in the mountains, and they took part in guerrilla type warfare, hide and seek tactics against the Ottomans and against wealthy Christians who were living well due to their powerful positions in the Ottoman administrative system. The armatoli, this is another term that is very important. These were local Christian subjects set up and armed by the Ottomans to withstand the klephts. But often some ended up switching sides. So there's a lot of switching from armatoli, working for the Ottomans, to klephts on your own, stealing from the Ottomans and the wealthy Christians. Dimitris Livanios notes that the leadership of the revolution was characterized by multiple rifts. You have divisions between locals and newcomers, such as the Fanariotes, Mavrokordatos and Ypsilandis are among these newcomers with their progressive Western ideas. You have divisions between the Peloponnesians, the Islanders, and the Roumeliotes in the central part of Greece. There are also differences of opinion between the military men, Kolokotronis' people, and the notables. Often, well, some scholars use primates to cover all of those different levels of notables. You also have differences of opinion, of course, between the peasants and the notables, and those people who either look to Russia or France or Britain for potential help, and underlying forces of tradition on the one hand, wanting to cling to these old power structures, and modernity, these new ideals, ideas about the nation state and ideals of democracy. The notables had significant political power because they played a key role in the government of the Peloponnese. They were tax farmers engaged in trade and money lending. So if a peasant wasn't able to pay their loan, there was money lending, and then that awful spiral of debt that could follow. The notables' power was personal, local, and based on the extended family or the clan. Before the revolution, their political control over the peasants was certain. And these notables enhanced their power by forming alliances, but these were always shifting alliances between or with other Muslim notables or other Christian notables, always competing for power. Many members of these powerful families took part in the political leadership of the revolution, and that was because they wanted to participate because they realized that in order to safeguard the political power of the past, they would have to be involved. They realized that once the revolution was underway, it would be more costly for them to stay out of what was going on. Their fortunes were based on land ownership, whereas the islanders were ship owners, and they had made their fortunes from trade. So there were lots of differences, and when you start to think about how many differences and divisions there were among these leaders, it's almost a miracle that they managed to make it succeed. Kolokotronis begins by telling us that his family was one of klephts, and that they had been in constant opposition to the Ottomans, the Turks. He calls them Turks, so I'll do the same for tonight. And he says that they were always against the Turks. Since they arrived in his parts, we have been at war with the Turks since the 16th century. So από 1553 όπου έφτασαν στα μέρη μας οι Τούρκοι ποτέ δεν τους ανεγνώρισαν, αλλά ήσαν εις αιώνιον πόλεμον. He tells us that he was born in 1770 under a tree on the mountain Ramovouni in Messenia. His father was the leader of Armatolous in Corinth. He then went to Mani and pursued the Turks. So there's a bit of a change. He becomes a cleft. His father was killed by the Turks when Kolokotronis was very young. Kolokotronis himself became a cleft at a very young age. And at 15, Kolokotronis was recognized as a chief of Armatolous at a place called Leondari in southwest Arcadia. At 20 years of age, Kolokotronis marries the daughter of a chief, a village notable of Leondari, Ekaterini, but he's always on watch, being very, very careful because he knows that the Turks are out to get him, to kill him. And he says that he was 27 years old when they first began to hunt me down. He then leaves with 12 Kolokotronis family members. They go down to Mani and they become klephts. They come out as klephts and they're at loggerheads with the Turks. They're actually going back and forth again, klephts and Armatoli, for about 4 to 5 years, he tells us. He was so dangerous that they had a firman issued to kill him and a friend of his, Petit Mazin. And the notables were told that it was either going to be their heads or their own. And then there was a second firman, an edict, an order that said that the Sultan wanted all klephts to be pursued and killed. So in 1806, Kolokotronis, around 36 years of age, takes refuge on the island of Zakynthos. And there he organizes for the Greeks of the Ionian Islands to request help from the Emperor of Russia to organize to expel the Ottomans from their lands. But nothing comes of that. Okay. His band of 150 men starts to attack the Turks. So he goes back to the mainland and he has a band which changes in number, but he's attacking the Turks. He was being pursued. He had to, along with his men, had to steal bread in order to survive. They were always on the run, seeking protection with friends when possible. In his memoirs, he says that this kind of life actually helped them a lot during the revolution, because we got to know very well the lie of the land, the pathways, the advantageous positions, the people. We also got used to enduring hunger, thirst, suffering, filth, and so forth. Kolokotronis also serves in the British Army, and he was rewarded for his service and his bravery with the rank of major. In the British Army, he acquired tactical knowledge and the experience of regular warfare. And there he met Richard Church, who became a lifelong friend of his. And Kolokotronis and the other captains wrote up a request, this time to the British, asking for assistance to liberate their homeland. But again, nothing happened. And it was then, he says in his memoirs, that I realized that whatever we were going to do, we had to do alone and not depend on others. Iva tote ότι θα το κάνουμε μονάχοι και δεν έχουμε ελπίδα καμία από τους ξένους. In 1818, he was initiated into the Φιλικιατερία, the secret society of friends, the underground organization established a little bit earlier to organize the Greeks to rebel. He was sent by the society to Mani in the Peloponnese to inform one of the notables there, Petrobi Mavromichalis, to prepare. The Turks found out about the plan, and so the Greeks had to move a little bit earlier than originally planned. And on the 23rd of March, 1821, they liberated Kalamata. He had told the families in Mani to organize to besiege the Turks at every tower in the centers in that area. He says that he was very moved, Kolokotronis was very moved seeing people come out with their icons, so villagers and priests coming out with their icons, offering thanksgiving when the revolution got underway. He was 50 years old when he entered the revolution. The sense that one gets when reading Kolokotronis' memoirs is one of shifting alliances, so it's actually very hard to keep track of them, and Kolokotronis having to be very cautious about whom he can trust. And secondly, a sense of being always on the move, the constant search for bread, psomi, and a safe place to rest, and the constant gathering of men to fight along the way. As he was going from place to place, he would gather more men. And at any one time, his band might have 100 or 200, 300, maybe even as few as 10 men. He would say to them, those of you who love your homeland, come with me. In the first year of the revolution, he tried to bring together the powerful rival families in Mani, in the south. He keeps moving from one district to the next, as I said, trying to gather men. His goal was for the Greeks to besiege as many of the forts in the Peloponnese as possible, those medieval towers and fortifications scattered throughout the landscape, where many of the Ottomans sought refuge once the uprising began. In particular, he believed that they should focus on the largest fort, Tripolitsa, which was the base of the Ottoman Pasha. And he believed that this needed to be taken, otherwise it would allow the Ottomans to march out, attack, and then continually retreat to safety, regroup, and prepare for another attack. So they needed to get Tripolitsa. And he set up camps. So Tripolitsa is in the center, and he set up camps all around that main fort at key points strategically around the countryside: Piana, Chrysovitsi, Valtetsi, Vervena, Doliana. This way, Tripoli, he believed, if they could get it, it would be cut off from the rest. If they could besiege it, it would be cut off from the rest of the Peloponnese. That the Turks wouldn't be able to acquire provisions, and in this way they would force them, the Greeks would force them to surrender. His presence on the Peloponnese encouraged his fellow countrymen, and it spread fear among the enemy. His family name was known for hundreds of years, so there was a big reputation behind him. We know that Kolokotronis was a charismatic leader. He had a way with words, and he could inspire his men, but he also used some other clever, peculiar means to get them to fight. In his memoirs, he tells of how he had to pretend sometimes in order to encourage his men to get into battle. In the middle of a battle that was about to be lost, he tells us that because the Greeks were retreating, he cried out in joy as if they had just, in another part of the fighting, dealt the Turks a very decisive blow. And in this way, he deceived his own men and got them to come back and from fugitives become pursuers of the Turks. He was full of resource. He was a resourceful man, especially in crisis, in times of crisis and bad luck. Kapodistrias actually calls him the Odysseus of contemporary Greece. And he is, of course, known also by the name, by Yeros to Moria, the old man of Moria. Not necessarily on account of his age, which wasn't great, even though 50 at that time was older than 50 now, but more so perhaps owing to his experience, his clear judgment, and his never-ending resourcefulness. He says in his memoirs how just before the Battle of Valtetsi, he had ordered encampments to be set up close to one another so that one could run and help the other if necessary. And he would sleep at Valtetsi, have lunch at Piana, and have dinner at Chrysovitsi so that he could check each position daily. Khursid Pasha was in Epirus fighting against Ali Pasha, so he sent Mustafa Bey down to Tripolitsa. He passes Patra, he reaches Acrocorintho and then Nafplio and starts to attack Valtetsi. After a full day of fighting, Kolokotronis once again shouts out to encourage his men, and he screams out at the Turks, "I'm going to catch you alive, I'm Kolokotronis." These cries of encouragement really worked on his soldiers. The Greeks were inspired and fought. The Turks took flight, leaving behind, in this case, 600 dead, 2 cannons, numerous weapons and provisions. Kolokotronis views this as the critical battle. If we had lost it, he says, we would have had a lot of difficulty making another stand. The battle had lasted 23 hours. It was a Friday, and at the end of it, he actually told his troops to fast and to offer a prayer of thanksgiving to God. We hear of Bubulina writing to Kolokotroni around this time, asking for help. And later on, we hear that Kolokotronis, because, Bubulina, of course, is the freedom fighter from Spetses, originally Idra, but that's where her home now is. And later on, Kolokotroni, in his memoirs, when he's at Argos, he tells his son Pano, who married her daughter, Eleni, to tell his mother-in-law, Bubulina, to come to that particular place. And if she saw that there was war, that she could support them with her cannons from sea. The alliance that Kolokotronis and Bubulina made through that wedding of their children was a very clever one, because you have the land forces of Kolokotroni combining with the naval forces of Bubulina through that marriage. On hearing about our progress, Kolokotronis says, the islanders, Spetses, Idra, started sending us provisions, ammunition, and leather for shoes. And then he would receive all these provisions and distribute them as was necessary. They would get their gunpowder from Vimitsana, and from that battle at Valtetsi and a couple of other victories afterwards, the Greeks started to gain confidence. Still, he ordered that anyone deserting the cause would be caught and have their house burnt to the ground. So he had to threaten them to make sure that he would still have the recruits that he needed. The Greek villagers were so encouraged, though, at this point at least, that they started bringing supplies of bread on their own to each camp, as well as animals. He talks about sheep, goats being brought to them, so they didn't have to steal them anymore. The villagers at this point were encouraged, excited about the prospect of a change, and were helping them as much as possible. While the siege of Tripolitsa was a military victory, this particular battle or siege was accompanied by excesses that even Kolokotronis regretted and disapproved of. There were thousands of people inside the besieged town, and since the provisions were waning and their water was failing, the Greeks had put foxglove, a very toxic plant, into the streams. Hunger was setting in, and they were in a dire situation. They were in danger of starving to death. So they started to negotiate with Kolokotroni. There were about 3,000 Albanians, he says, who negotiated with him for their release. And the deal, he explains, was that the Greeks would allow the Arvanites to come out unharmed, and they could leave with their weapons, but the Turks had to leave their weapons behind, which the Turks rejected. They didn't want to do that. Kolokotronis says, I gave them my word, the Arvanites, that they would go unharmed if they agreed to this deal. He says that there were about 20,000 Greeks assembled around Tripolitsa, and he had to remind them, don't kill the Arvanites. But nobody listened. Some Greeks had managed to climb the walls and they had jumped inside. They opened the gates, and the slaughter that followed was horrific. Kolokotroni actually says, my horse from the walls up to the palace did not touch the ground, meaning that his horse was trampling over dead bodies. Very powerful and awful image there. Το άλογο μου από τα τείχη έως τα σαράγια δεν επάτησε γη. But he stopped those Greeks who tried to attack the Arvanites. He protected them with his own personal bodyguard. He was faithful. He says, I was faithful to my word of honor. And this is a very basic timeline to just remind us that there were these assemblies going on at the time. The first National Assembly had met in December. Kolokotronis was not there at that one, but this assembly the leaders were working on a constitution. They were drafting a constitution. They had included a declaration of independence. We have Kalamata, Valtetsi, and many others as well, but these are some of the key battles that Kolokotroni was involved in before the first National Assembly was held. And then we have, what's next? Yes, there's a lot that I could say, but we need to keep moving. So Dervenakia, the Battle of Dervenakia. So rumors started to spread that the dreaded army of Dramalis was coming down to the Peloponnese. They had crossed the isthmus from the north, and they were approaching. Kolokotronis has a note saying that his political adversaries had put an end to the siege of Patra, and then alleged that he had abandoned the siege with his men. So there was a lot of infighting. He says in his memoirs, their aim was to prevent me from going to Patra to take the fort, and they wanted to reduce my military strength, my influence. Mavrokordatos was becoming more and more powerful, one of the Fanariotes. The government at this point, or the provisional government, escaped to safety because they were worried about Dramali on a ship from Idra at the Gulf of the Argalid. Kolokotroni at that point, or around that time, sends a message to this provisional government asking them not to forget them. I ask you that you do not abandon us. We need to battle. We need to fight at Dervenakia. We need to take Dervenakia by land, and also the Gulf of Corinth by sea. Don't neglect the wages either. He had fighters that needed to be paid. Okay. So the provisional government has fled to safety. Everyone else is now turning to Kolokotroni as the only hope of any kind of escape from Dramali. Kolokotroni summoned a military council in Argos, and his plan was approved by them. The goal, he said, was to delay the enemy around the fort of Larissa at Argos until the Greeks had gathered the requisite number of men in order to fight against them. The enemy entered the plain of Argolis in early July. The fields had been burned. So this is what Kolokotroni, one of his tactics was to scorch the earth and not allow the enemy the luxury of the provisions that the land would have given them. The fighting at Larissa, then, this fort nearby, delayed this battle of Dervenakia by 12 days. The Turks are now at Larissa trying to take the fort there. Ypsilandis is inside and has given them the idea that they are well stocked for about 5 months, and that's why the Turks especially want to take the fort from the Greeks. But that was a lie. There were no provisions inside. It was just a delaying tactic, and it worked, because by the time he made it down to Dervenakia, Kolokotronis had brought together about 11,000 fighters. Kolokotronis trapped Dramalis in the region of Argos, from where he could not get back to Arcadia without provisions or easy travel. Dramalis's only exit was to return to Corinth, and Kolokotronis had stationed his men at all the mountain passes and all the springs. And Kolokotronis expected him to choose to go through Dervenakia. He had come through Dervenakia, the Dervenakia pass, successfully earlier to get to here, but this time Kolokotronis had put men there waiting for him. The trap was set. So the Greeks were stationed there waiting for him. And when the signal was given, they attacked. They shot, they attacked, and it was a disaster for Dramalis. His men dropped everything, animals, provisions, and scrambled up the mountainside to try to get away. So Kolokotronis here had outwitted and outmaneuvered Dramalis. And if you're thinking that this reminds you of an ancient battle, perhaps Leonidas's campaign against the Persians at Thermopylae in 480 BCE, you wouldn't be wrong. The Spartans there had managed to, even though they didn't end up winning, they had eliminated or reduced the advantage of the larger force of the Persians by luring them into a very narrow pass where their numbers didn't help them. And this is exactly what happened here at Dervenakia. It was the same strategy. Many Turks were killed in the pass. It's interesting, I think, that Kolokotronis doesn't dwell on this battle very much. Others have called it as the battle that saved the revolution. But for his part, the one that he thinks is the important one is Valtetsi from earlier on. Okay, at the Second National Assembly, what happens here? We have some more improvements to the constitution. There's talk about the freedom of press, abolishing slavery. And Kolokotronis at this Second National Assembly was elected vice president of the executive. The president was Mavrokordatos. There was a clear division between the military men, Kolokotronis and Ypsilantis, and the others. And in the end, those two, with their followers, created an anti-government faction. They decided not to obey the orders. Why? Because they weren't happy that things were changing. They could see that the other notables were putting into positions people not based on their merit, but based on nepotism. So this was going against everything that had been decided at the First National Assembly. His son, Panos, was in charge of the fort at Nafplion. He was killed around this time. And the government, the provisional government, imprisoned Kolokotroni and 14 other fighters for their defiance. They were taken to Idra and they were put into prison, confinement at the monastery of Prophet Elias for 4 months. Something happens in Idra that he doesn't tell us about in his memoirs, but I think that this and how he deals with it indicates something important about Kolokotronis's character. By the way, these are some of the individuals. Mavrokordatos here and Koletis are the two that Kolokotronis seems to have most difficulty with infighting. These two were, in Kolokotronis's eyes, newcomers. Mavrokordatos from Phanari, Koletis from Epirus, and he didn't like seeing them try to move in on what he believed, I guess, was rightfully his. He had his power base in the Peloponnese. These two started recruiting bands of their own in central Greece, but they were taking a lot of the positions in these national assemblies and making a lot of the decisions without consulting, which some others did not appreciate. So at Ivra, where he was thrown into confinement for his defiance of the provisional government, and well, in terms of the context, his wife Ekaterini had died a few years ago in 1820. He had just lost his son Pano, and as a parent, he was no doubt feeling a sense of guilt alongside the heartache of losing a child. But when he was there in Ivra, he gets very close to a nun by the name of Margarita Velisari, so close, in fact, that she becomes pregnant. And this is sometimes talked about as a scandal. What's he doing going and getting a nun pregnant? But given the context, the losses that he had recently experienced, and to be honest, I cringed as well when I first heard about this, but I wouldn't begrudge him that human connection, that human companionship that he seems to have found with Margarita. And he didn't just leave her there, he lived with Margarita afterwards. And in his will, he acknowledges the boy that is born as his son. He was named Panayotakis in memory of his firstborn, Panos. He asks his other sons, Yeneos and Kostadino, to have Panayotaki and his mother Margarita in the family home in case he dies, to have them in the family home until Panayotakis reaches the age of 20, after which he can take his share of his father's will and live with his mother as he pleases. And if Panayotakis should die, then his mother, Margarita, should be looked after in her old age. And I think that says quite a lot about the character of Kolokotronis. Okay. Meanwhile, we have the Sultan requesting help because things are not looking good for him. He needs help from his vassal in Egypt, Muhammad Ali. And Muhammad Ali sends his son, Ibrahim Pasha, with his well-trained troops to the Peloponnese in 1825. The government then, the provisional government, grants Kolokotronis and the other men a general amnesty in order to fight, to come and help, because he was threatening the outcome of the revolution as he was coming through the interior of the Peloponnese. So the government gave Kolokotronis and Petrobe Mavromichali responsibility for the Greek forces. Kolokotronis says in his memoirs, they saw the danger to the homeland and the will of the people. The people were screaming that they wanted their leaders out and back on the Peloponnese. And they released them, they freed them, and we agreed to put aside our differences and to work together for our country. But Ibrahim had already taken most of the Peloponnese, and he entered Tripolitsa in June 1825. Kolokotronis continued to have this kleftopolemo, warfare, cleft-like, with him until the end of the revolution. Then we have the governor, Kapodistrias, arriving in Greece in 1828. Kolokotronis admired his dedication, his desire to impose order, but those who could see that their own power would be diminished in this new system that Kapodistrias was designing started to plan his demise. And he was assassinated in September 1831. After Kapovistrias' assassination, Kolokotronis was appointed to a committee to help with things until the arrival of a king for Greece. But he resigned immediately because he had a disagreement with Kolektis. The factional fighting continued. This is Kapovistrias. And just a little bit about what Kolokotronis says in terms of how he was fighting Ibrahim Pasha. He engaged him in cleft style fighting with special bands harassing the enemy army. All right. So he had said to the government that he wanted to destroy the fort at Tripolitsa, as we heard earlier. He had said to them, if Ibrahim comes and takes Tripolitsa, then he can destroy the rest of the Peloponnese because he'll be in the center. And they told me, he says in his memoirs, we don't have the funds. Kolokotronis says to them, grant me permission and I'll destroy it in 5 days. I'll do it myself. I'll find the funds. But in the end, he says to them, he won't have a base if we do that, and we'll be able to join our forces together and attack him. Otherwise, our forces won't join up because they'll be fearful. And he says in his memoirs, that's exactly what happened in the end. They didn't follow his advice, and they lost that opportunity. Ibrahim, he says, couldn't understand how, as soon as he destroyed a camp of mine, he had a victory against us. In 2 days, I was able to set up a new one. He explains that without regular provisions, without animal feed, weapons, it was not feasible to set up a regular army on the side of the Greeks, a stable force of many men, because those men would have had no chance against the Ottomans' larger and better equipped soldiers. So this cleft-like warfare, guerrilla tactics, hide and seek, attack and then run away, served the Greeks very well. He had instructed the Greeks to attack suddenly from the front. So if they found a group of Turks to attack them suddenly from the front or from the rear or from the sides, he had told them to conduct surprise attacks on their camps at night, to burn their provisions so that they would run out, or steal them if they couldn't burn them. And fighting in this way also meant that the Greeks lost relatively smaller numbers of men every time. And that once the body of men was dispersed after an attack, it could regroup. Whereas if a large battle was to take place with great losses, it would be almost impossible to entice the survivors to fight against the odds that were stacked so much against them. Okay. Kolokotronis also talks about the French Revolution, and in his opinion, the French Revolution opened the eyes of the world to what was possible. Beforehand, he says, people thought that kings were gods on earth. So this was an opportunity to create a fairer world in this part of the world. One of the most memorable lines in his memoirs, I would say, is the following. He says at one point, «Ο κόσμος μας έλεγε τρελούς. Εμείς, αν δεν είμεθα τρελοί, δεν έκαναμε την επανάσταση». People called us crazy. If we weren't crazy, we would not have gone ahead with the revolution, because we ought to have considered that we didn't have weapons, cavalry, ammunition, not enough at least, not as much as the enemy. We didn't have provisions. We ought to have considered our power in relation to that of Turkey. Now that we've won, we're celebrated and praised. If we had not been successful, we would have been cursed and condemned. He's also very honest about the difficulties in leading a Greek force of fighting men. He had served in the British Army, so he could compare. And he says, in Europe, a commander orders his soldiers to do something and they obey. With the Greeks, you need to be leader, judge, mentor, friend. Everyone thinks they know best. And you have to find ways of persuading them to do as you say, with lies, with flattery, whatever is needed. Every Greek has his idiosyncrasies, and you have to either praise or threaten them depending on the individual. Kolokotronis retired at the end of his life to a property that he had just outside of Nafplion, but there his enemies started rumors that he was plotting to overthrow the regency, Otto and the regency, and he was condemned to death for treason. At the trial that took place, I'm a little bit behind, and this is Otto, young Otto. At the trial that took place, there were 5 judges. There were only 2 who refused to agree to the condemnation and execution of Kolokotronis. And one of them was this person, the statue of him here, George Tertsetis, who, yes, is the person to whom Kolokotronis dictated his memoirs. But his opponents had rifles pointed at this judge and the second one who refused to sign, and in the end they had to. So yes, in 1834, Kolokotronis and Plaputas were condemned to death for treason. However, the king changed that to 20 years imprisonment, and when he actually, this is Otto, when he actually took the throne, he pardoned them. He says in his memoirs that he had seen, Kolokotronis says he had seen death so many times and had not feared it, so he didn't fear it now. And in fact, he'd rather die unjustly than die justly under such circumstances. And the reception that the people gave him when he was released made him forget all the past misfortunes that he had suffered. He says, η υποδοχή που μου έκαμεν ο λαός με έκαμε να λησμονήσω όλες τις δυστυχίες όπου επέρασα. Kolokotronis died on the 4th of February in 1843 in Athens. And just one comment, drawing to a close here, a comment on the intervention of the great powers, and the notion that Greece owes a debt of gratitude to the French, the British, and the Russians for stepping in at Navarino, and the idea that the Greeks were pawns in the designs of the great foreign powers, that they didn't, or that they didn't know what they were doing. It's true, of course, that yes, these foreign powers stepped in and they annihilated the Ottoman Egyptian fleet of Ibrahim in the Bay of Navarino. And it's true that many Philhellenes supported the cause, and some even lost their lives for it. However, I think we do a great injustice to the Greek fighters of the revolution by underestimating their own commitment to the cause. These people knew exactly what they were doing and what they were fighting for. Throughout his memoirs, Kolokotronis talks about his dedication to and his vision of a liberated patrida, country, homeland, and ethnos. he talks about ta merimas και τον τόπο μας, our lands, our places of birth being finally liberated. Our revolution, he says, was not like any of those going on in Europe. Europe's uprisings were against governments. They were civil wars in a sense. Ours was more just, he says. It was nation against nation. Ito ethnos me άλλο ethnos. It was against the people whose sultan never desired to regard the Greek people as anything but slaves. Kolokotronis was a strategic genius. He dedicated his life to the cause. He was determined. His name has become synonymous with the revolution. He was a genuine leader of the people. And his story, I think, highlights the sacrifices of all those individual men and women who participated in the uprising. His inner strength, determination, sacrifice, love for his country informed and inspired the thinking of all those who believed along with him that there was a better way of life there to be gained, that there was something better possible and worth fighting for. One of the profound messages of this revolution that continues to inspire us today, I think, is that it does demonstrate that unity of purpose and steadfast commitment to a worthy cause can turn dreams into reality. The Greeks were united where it mattered. They had their infighting, but when when crunch time came around, they put those differences aside and they worked together. It's very easy sometimes when we focus on the international relations, nation building exercises, intervention of foreign powers and historical events in general, to lose sight of the fact that we have actual individuals taking part in these events. Or sometimes we elevate them to such heights that we forget that they were actual mortal beings themselves. So I just hope that by focusing on the life of Kolokotronis, we've been able to pay tribute to all those heroic men and women who took part in the revolution, who devoted their lives to the ideal of freedom, and whose fierce, independent spirit and perseverance are examples from which all of us can learn something. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, Stavroula, on that seminar on one of the most influential figures of the Greek War of Independence, Theodoros Kolokotronis, and I'm sure there'll be quite a few questions from the audience that have been following it, and we've had quite a few. Have a question here from Conspiropoulos. Kolokotronis' role during the Greek Revolution is well noted. However, to what extent should Kolokotronis be made accountable for the civil wars between the Greeks and the massacre of Tripoli?
I think mistakes were made on both sides. So, yeah, I mean, when there isn't the correct communication, of course, that leadership will break down, and there were a number of breakdowns. But I don't think we can hold, I wouldn't hold him accountable. There were so many different moving parts to what was going on that, I wouldn't assign blame to anyone.
Okay. I have another question from Angelo. I'll go to the second part of his question. Can you buy his memoirs online? We are posting a link. His memoirs have been translated in English, and I think we're going to paste a link on an Amazon link if you want to sort of purchase his memoirs. But the Greek versions are definitely available from online Greek bookshops like Politi and so forth. But Angela's question is, do we know if Kolokotronis has any surviving descendants today?
There are groups who are tracking doing work on their family trees. But I'm not sure if we have any here. If there are any in the audience who'd like to share that information with us, that would be fantastic. There is a group in the US who are they're tracking this, trying to figure out exactly where they belong in the family tree.
Okay. We've got another comment from Peter Iglesiaki about purchasing a book on Kolokotronis. We will be posting a link. And I suppose anyone with the surname of Kolokotronis, more or less you can assume there's some type of link, no matter how sort of tenuous. And a question from Adonia Smiras. Thank you for the presentation. Do his memoirs make any mention of his thoughts on the foreign sovereigns that we ended up with? I suppose on his how he perceived King Otto.
Right. Well, even though he's not a sovereign, I know. Well, his memoirs indicate that he definitely admired, respected Kapodistrias. He didn't always understand why he was making the decisions that he was, but when those decisions were explained to him, he did respect them. With Otto, I think. Well, I'm not sure. Okay. Sorry to be so, but I don't have enough information on that. No.
A question from John Kosiaris. Interesting lecture. In his memoirs, did Kolokotronis indicate whether he had a closest ally? Let's say a partner in crime or someone very close to him. Was there anyone in particular who perhaps played a significant role in helping him strategize?
One name that he definitely, one person that he trusts implicitly seems to be Koliopoulos. And this was a family that had protected him in the past. They were family friends from way back, and from all of them that come up in his memoirs, that's a steadfast and loyal friend, from what I can tell.
Okay. I'm going to probably rephrase a question here from Mary Panotis. Apart from his memoirs, are there any sort of books on the Kolokotronis that you recommend that some are sort of better than others, or other biographies, or in your readings? Are there any particular titles you'd recommend?
There are some recent ones, such as the one that came out just this year, The Greek Revolution, by Kytromilidis and Tsoukalas. That gives you a nice updated overview. So I would recommend that one. And then there are articles scattered in various journals. But for a very up-to-date overview, I would recommend that.
Yeah, well, I think it's got a very good bibliography, so that would have further references to look into. So the latest, I think it's a historical dictionary of the revolution by Tsoukalas and Kytromilidis. A question from Vasily Tsamis. Kolokotronis understood the strategic value of Tripolitsa and the topography of the Peloponnese, but did he believe liberation was possible with klept tactics alone, especially with Ibrahim's intervention?
I think I'm not an expert on this particular thing, but from the memoirs that I've spent quite a bit of time looking at, I get the sense that he sees the value of cleft warfare, but he would have liked at some point, for instance, if they had been able to take Tripolitsa during Ibrahim's time, then he would have liked to have joined all of those cleftic bands together. So to some extent, I think he realized the advantages and the limitations of cleft warfare. They served their purpose, but I sense that perhaps he also could see that there was something a little bit more that was needed if they were going to overtake such a large Turkish Ottoman force.
And a question from Athanasios Tsiglopoulos. Would the revolution have been successful without any external foreign help?
That's an interesting question, and most scholars, I think, would say that the foreign intervention at the end, with the Battle of Navarino, secured the end of the revolution, and that would not have been possible otherwise. On the other hand, we could also say that if the Greeks hadn't revolted in the first place, we wouldn't have come to that point. So I guess both. It all played a part.
Yeah, they're sort of tricky, those what if questions in history. So yeah, I think you still would have got independence. Maybe the date would have been delayed, but yeah, it's there's so many tipping points sometimes. Thank you, Steffi. We might bring our proceedings to a close here, and just to give participants a reminder of next week's seminar on the architect and urban planner Konstantinos Doxiadis. And the following week, we follow this 1821 theme. We have Juliana Harpandidou giving us a seminar on the early constitutions of the Greek Revolution and who was Greek, who was considered Greek in that initial nation-state sort of formation. Stavroula, thanks once again. Best of luck for the rest of the year. Enjoy your online courses. That's not our purpose, but what do? We have to sort of get on with the times, and yeah, hope to see you again in some future seminar series. And
thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.